All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of this very important conclave. I think we've had a great first session yesterday, and it's early in the morning, and I hope you got your coffees armed with you. We are going to get into a very interesting topic, which is or has become quite a scene of debate over the past year or two. Specifically with the quote-unquote defeat of the Islamic State and the destruction of the geographical caliphate that they were operating in. The whole concept of or question of returning fighters, fighters that had joined ISIS, for example, in Syria or Iraq, trying to return to their country of origin, and what that means for that country of origin and that state and that government. And what kind of plans do they have to counter this potential threat? So we've got a very excellent panel today. We've got Nooshin Waheed. She is the chairperson of the Maldivian Democracy Network. And we've got Raffaello Pantucci. He's the director of international studies at the Royal United Services Institute in London. We've got Sajid Shapoo, who is an Indian police service officer and a PhD scholar at Princeton. And of course, we've got Shandon Harris-Hogan, who's the director of Radar Solutions. So welcome, everyone. It's great to have you here. And let's get to the crux of this panel, which is first and foremost, returning fighters. I just want to know from each one of you, one by one, are there any we are maybe 2 years into this becoming a hot topic of debate, maybe, right? Are there any conceptual frameworks around this yet? Do countries and do states and do governments know what they're dealing with or know how to deal with this and have a good idea of integrating these fighters back into their particular societies, the same societies where they grew up in most cases. So if I can just ask Nooshin to start off. And
so I would say that actually no country has the correct answer yet, and it's something that we're dealing with and figuring out as we go along. Some countries have chosen to revoke citizenship of foreign terrorist fighters, while others choose to focus on rehabilitation. But I believe that the reality is that these are radicalized individuals who pose a security threat. And so states should provide avenues for disengagement and deradicalization and not leave them to become someone else's problem. In the Maldives, historically, we've refused to even acknowledge that we have this problem. But that's changed recently. The Maldivian president recently, about a month ago, stated that he would be bringing back women and children from Syria. We haven't reached a policy decision regarding bringing back male FDFs yet.
But per capita, Maldives remains the highest provider.
Yes, yes. 1 in 2,000, I think.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
All right.
I know this is not something that a lot of people here knew. I realized that when I spoke to people today. So this is an interesting challenge for the Maldives, and there will be rehabilitation centers built in the Maldives specifically to deal with this, and we are looking into help from other countries in terms of designing programs as well.
Raffaello, if I could take this same debate to Europe and ask you the whole debate between especially the European countries and the US at the moment, where the US seems to be forcing them to take their fighters back. And there seems to be some countries at least that are apprehensive. And in that process, we know that, for example, Iraq has made these haphazard, quick-fire courts that are going through cases like wildfire. In many cases, sentencing people to death without any due process, or process that they've built up overnight. So what's the larger narrative on returning fighters as a concept in Europe?
Well, I mean, it's, when you talk about Europe, you're talking about, well, it depends how you count Europe, but almost 40 different countries.
Yeah.
So it becomes very difficult to imagine that you've got any sort of a coherent response from across the continent. And then if you break it down to the European Union, in the EU, you've got different responses in different parts of the EU. Then, of course, you've got the nightmare of Brexit, which is creating another. So there's a whole series of complexities to the question within a European context. But what often strikes me about this whole debate is how we talk about it as though it's new, when it's really not. We've seen foreign fighter flows to conflict zones going back to the 1970s and 1980s. You know, European fighters have been showing up in these fields for a long time. And so in a way, it's sort of incredible to me that we're getting to this stage now where we just kind of can't cope with this issue. And so the question is, why is that? And I think part of it is the fact that we're seeing women and children involved. So it's no longer easy to just say it's young men, you know, it's a sort of cohort, a group of people we can kind of understand. Now it's a far muddier picture. It's also not very clear that we have totally understood, and again, this is something you see playing out across Europe, what kind of a threat does this actually pose? You know, I think, again, if we've forgotten our history, which is if you go back and look at history, there are instances where we've seen foreign fighters come back and be involved in terrorist plots, being directed to be involved in plots, but in an awful lot of cases, the individuals seem to come back and sort of self-demobilize. And in some cases, they end up becoming the sort of the progenitors of the seeds of future networks. And so how you manage that particular problem, which is somebody who's come back with a radical impulse, isn't actually doing anything about it at the time, but is kind of helping spread those ideas. And so, you know, I think European countries are all looking at this issue in their different kind of way and with different legal jurisdictions and saying, well, you know, this is the whole range of different issues we're trying to tackle. How do we tackle it? And everyone's dealing with their own different ways. In some European countries, you've seen there has been a more active effort towards repatriation, towards bringing people back or focusing on women and children. In other cases, we've seen a much more aggressive approach to just keeping people out, passport stripping, basically preventing return or just sort of leaving it to become someone else's problem. And to be honest, I think an awful lot of that is being driven by politics. And it really is political leaders in the countries who are looking at the situation and feeling the public mood. And broadly speaking, the public mood across Europe is these people made a choice. You know, they made their bed, let them sleep in it, quite frankly. And if that's the broader political context, you know, it's very difficult in some way to get politicians to come forwards and be much more progressive about how they're going to manage it. My own personal view is we should be repatriating them and incarcerating them and managing them in that way. These are our nationals and we should be dealing with these issues. But that's a very difficult pitch to a political context.
Especially these days.
Especially these days, you know, when people look at it and say, you know, especially when these people go and do interviews in our media where they talk about not having forgotten their ISIS ideas and talk about, you know, how wonderful the caliphate was, you know, it's very difficult to then say, let's spend scarce government resources on bothering to repatriate this person to create a whole wave of other issues potentially in the future.
Right. So, Sajid, on the same line of questioning, of course, like Raffaello said, a lot of politics is involved. But as far as the state structures go and law enforcement goes, is rehabilitation the correct way to go? And if that rehabilitation has to take place, is that a policing issue or is that a community issue?
Thank you. Before answering your question, I just want to take a cue from Raffaello. This is not the first time we are dealing with this situation of returnees. If you remember, go back 3 decades ago, most people have forgotten that around 20 to 30,000 returnees came from the Afghan theater. Okay. Some of them came back to Pakistan. Most of them went back to Middle East and other countries. There were cases many cases wherein these returnees ended up setting up their own jihadi organizations or radical organizations in the host countries. But at the same time, many cases, what Raffaello said, were this there was a self-deradicalization which happened, and they, merged into community. Some of them took political causes. If there is Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, if we also call him a returnee because he came to Afghanistan then went back, then for every Zarqawi there are people like Mustafa Hamid, who was famously known as Abu Walid al-Masri. He's now in Egypt, leading a peaceful life, and many like him. So, looking at the past, I think for us it's a two-pronged problem. One is the law enforcement part of it. Second is the rehabilitation and deradicalization part of it. The law enforcement part is very clear because if the returnees are the fighters who left our country and joined ISIS or AQIS or Al-Qaeda, if they are guilty of a legal provision, we can, we can't say that, okay, now we'll waive it off. They'll have to, go through the due process of law, and it has happened also. And then the second part is the community part of it comes the deradicalization. I don't think we are yet very equipped to deal with that. We have had deradicalization programs, but the kind of federal structure we have, it's mostly a state, individual states do that. There's been, I would say there's been lack of cohesion and lack of a uniform policy. But the question is, do we need to have a uniform policy or not? And what sort of deradicalization program do we need? Do we need something like what Saudi Arabia boasted successful, of a successful deradicalization program, and certainly they noted that people kept coming back. Whenever somebody was de-radicalized, he would go into the society and in a week or two again tweet something or write something about ISIS. And then he was brought back. And some study was done, then they found out because when these people, they went into society, they could not earn that much, and then they wanted to come back to the facility because it was a great facility, they had food, they had all the facilities there. So the community part of it, the de-radicalization part of it is something I think we as a country need to work on and need to evolve a policy wherein multiple stakeholders need to be. It's not only a law enforcement or a state security thing. There are multiple stakeholders in that.
Right. And we'll get back to the DRAD question in detail in a bit. But Shandon, you worked with the government, you work outside the government, you've dissed the government inside and outside, and you've had a more sort of practical look at it maybe already. So what's your experience been so far on the whole question of returning fighters?
Yeah, I echo the comments from previous panelists very much. Yeah. In terms of the Australian context, just to kind of point out the scale of the problem that we're dealing with in Australia, we've had around about 230 individuals travel to Syria and Iraq. Out of those, a number have been killed.
That's more than India.
Yeah, it's quite a significant number that we're dealing with. And at the current time, we're looking at about 100 individuals who would be located somewhere within the conflict zone, which will potentially be repatriated to Australia at some point. The government approach to this problem so far in Australia has been two-pronged. There's been a quite extensive legal approach. We've passed 7 or 8 pieces of legislation, most of which were specifically aimed around managing foreign fighters. It's some of the most extensive legislation anywhere in the world. When you aggregate it all together, it's actually the biggest change to our criminal code in 100 years. So that's how seriously politicians have been looking at this problem. But when you look at these 8 pieces of legislation, or 9 if you count some others, so far we've managed to prosecute 1 returning. So I'll let you guys make your own decisions about how effective or ineffective you think that approach might be. Certainly something we need in the toolbox, and we need a legislative approach to some returnees, but that's definitely something that's not going to work for all of them. The other approach our government's had quite recently is to go what I would affectionately call tech bashing, and blaming whether it's Facebook, Twitter, or other online social media platforms for this phenomenon. When we look, though, and start to humanise a little bit and look at what this cohort of 100 or so individuals and potential returnees looks like, we can break this down, and we see that around 30-40% of these individuals and the foreign fighters we've had are directly related by blood to other members of the network, our Australian Jihadist network, who were previously involved. About another 50% of those grew up with somebody prior to the age of 18 who was also in the network and was their primary reason for joining. So we've seen for more than 90% of these individuals, we're talking about an intensely social process. Yes, the online space has acted as an echo chamber to reinforce already existing beliefs. Yes, it has broadened people's networks, but as a researcher, we've seen little to no evidence of what we call online radicalisation. It's an intensely social process.
I think that brings up a very interesting question, and I think it's been out there in the discourse a fair bit of this whole concept of offline radicalization actually being much more effective than the whole debate around online radicalization, which has sort of taken over the space over the last couple of years. But Raffaello, I just want to take something that Shandon said here and ask you, since you, as far as legislations goes, we hear about legislations to deal with foreign fighters in a very prominent way now. But if Europe has actually seen this before, in the 90s and 80s, why is the whole concept of legislation or to legislate this problem such an issue now and wasn't so much before?
Well, I think it's because the way the problem has expressed itself is different now. And the sheer volume and the amount of people we saw traveling to join ISIS in such a short period of time. I mean, if you think about the amount of people who went to Afghanistan back in the sort of 80s and 90s from Europe, we're not talking about that many people, but there were some who went. In fact, the big sort of mobilization you saw in Europe was really around Bosnia, the conflict in Bosnia in the 90s and the civil war that happened there. We saw a lot of Europeans sort of going in. And actually, you saw problems emanating out from that. In particular in France, you saw a couple of attacks take place, and you saw some networks which produced some real problems there. And so there was a sense of there was a realization that this was kind of an issue, but the travel to the group wasn't necessarily the part that was legislatively focused upon. What was focused upon was people who come back to try to launch terrorist attacks. Mm-hmm. And so you're managing with that side of the problem. So the attempt was to deal with that and the networks around that rather than the sort of impulse to go and travel. What we've seen in Syria and Iraq is the sort of rapidity with which we saw vast numbers of Europeans going has kind of changed that dynamic. I mean, that actually now have to manage a kind of very different sort of problem. So I think it is purely a sort of very simple problem like that. But then, of course, across Europe, you've got the fact that different countries have different approaches and different legislative ways of dealing with this, different judicial systems. If you look at a country like Holland or Denmark, for example, they've done their approach has been very focused on rehabilitation and very focused on that side of the equation. Whereas if you look at a country like France or the United Kingdom, it's been much more about, well, let's just try to keep them out, frankly.
So let me make this a little more pointed to all that you've said. Of course, Denmark is doing it in a different way, Netherlands is doing it in a different way. What about the European Union as an organization? What has their approach been on this? Because, of course, I'm presuming there were divisions within the members, within the European Union, of how to deal with this judicially or legislatively. Mm. So the whole sort of umbrella of the European Union system, I remember we were seeing some sort of fractures sort of coming up on these issues. Mm. When Hungary closed their borders while Germany was still accepting returnees and refugees alike at that point. So from a EU perspective, how has this actually played out?
Well, it's played out in a very, typically confusing and European way. The problem is that, of course, Europe can't tell member states to do stuff, especially on national security grounds. I mean, there they can advise and they can try to coordinate. And what you've seen is the EU itself has tried to, they have a thing called the Radicalisation Awareness Network, which is very focused on trying to spread best practice around the union. I mean, one of the early realizations that I think you saw in Europe when we saw the problems emanating from Syria and Iraq coming back was the realization that there was a vastly different capacity in each member state to deal with these problems. So a country like the United Kingdom, which has had terrorist problems and dealt with them for a long time, had a fairly mature sort of approach to dealing with these issues and had thought about it a lot. But other countries, like Portugal, they hadn't really thought about these things at all. And so they had no sort of context with it to manage it, and yet they had these problems to get. So the push from a European perspective has really been to try to spread best practice and try to improve connectivity around the union so people are all thinking about this in the same way. But
sharing capacity was one of the sort of tenets of the European Union, right?
But on national security grounds, it's still very much member state capitals who dominate those discussions. I mean, to veer way off this discussion, all this talk about a European army being created is a bit fantastical because member states are never going to let their national security and their army be guided by someone in a different capital. Right. That's a very important member state thing, and that's true, very true of these sorts of issues as well.
Right. Nooshin, clearly large organizations such as the European Union has been facing such issues, and so has the United States and Canada and various other nations. Maldives is very small. And you just said that there may not have been a sense of urgency earlier to deal with this issue. What changed and why?
I think the Easter attacks in Sri Lanka really changed perspective for everyone in the Maldives because it hit so close to home. And we in the civil society community have been talking about this for almost 10 years now, and it's only now that, we also had a change in government recently with the elections in 2018, so the new administration is definitely more open to talking about this. They're open to acknowledging that we have a problem and there's a lot that we need to fix. So that's the kind of change in political climate at the moment. Yeah.
Right, but has there been, we talk about often South Asia as sort of a collective of sorts. Has there been, or was there prior to the Sri Lanka attacks, was there a robust sort of mechanisms between states of South Asia that sort of, even civil society, and I'm not definitely saying states, but within civil society, that this is a growing problem and we need to address it as a collective unit, or was it always a fairly fractured mandate as far as this thing went?
I think civil society has been doing a lot better than governments, and in terms of talking about our collective issues with regard to radicalization, and I think there's a lot of commonality with the issues that we face. There's a lot of vigilante extremism in the Maldives, for example. There was the regular death threats and attacks against liberal.
Could you just
bloggers.
explain vigilante extremism a little bit? Like, what do you mean by it?
So we've only had one act of terrorism as such in the Maldives, which was the Sultan Park IED explosion in 2007. But so, a lot of people say, okay, terrorism isn't really an issue in the Maldives because there hasn't really been an attack beyond that. But the reality is that there are groups of extremists operating in the Maldives with impunity. Security services have been protecting them for the longest time. And what they have done is they are labeling liberal bloggers, liberal scholars, journalists as being la dini, which is irreligious, or basically un-Islamic, that's what they're suggesting. And putting a target on them and saying, okay, you can go and attack them. And we've had attempted murders, we've had an abduction, we've had actual murders of liberal bloggers and scholars and activists, human rights activists in the Maldives. So,
Right.
yeah.
Okay, so Sajid, even India has seen very few, but couple of cases of returnees, so to speak. Most of them were willingly, and they were prosecuted through the judicial process and so on and so forth. But also, in the past 1 year, we've started hearing Indian deradicalisation programs sort of taking shape. And at least there were, according to the report that came in Indian Express like a couple of days ago about the Maharashtra's deradicalisation program, which is led by the ATS, so the Anti-Terror Squad. And we've been talking almost 2 days now of how the civil society needs to be sort of the harbinger of these things. Can you give me just some input on what you think of an organization such as the ATS in Maharashtra actually being the face of a deradicalisation program?
Well, this is my personal opinion. This does not reflect anything official in it, but I don't think so. Agencies like ATS or a counterterror agency can be a face of a deradicalization program. They can be a very important part of it. They can be a very important spoke, but the hub has to be focused on the community part of it, because see. The title of the conference is Tackling Insurgent Ideologies. So when we are talking about de-radicalization, ideology becomes a very important part of it. And if you are handling a narrative with a counter-narrative, and if the counter-narrative happens to be socio-religious or mostly religious, then we don't think so that law enforcement agencies or security agencies they might be well equipped in the sense of the expertise they have, but they should not be the face of it. A small example is we just brush everything with, okay, these are Salafi jihadists. So Salafi jihadists is Salafism, Salafi ideology. Let's try to de-radicalize them. But then do we actually understand what this hybrid term Salafi jihadi is? even somebody like Taliban, most of the Western scholars have also portrayed them kind of Salafi jihadists, but if you call a Talibani a Salafi, he would get very wild. He said, I'm a Hanafi Deobandi. How dare you call me a Wahhabi Salafi? So I think that understanding is very important if we need to have a counter-narrative, and the counter-narrative has to be, focused on, one, the societal part of it, second, the scriptural part of it, because most of the people who join these organizations, most of them claim to be very, they are convinced that what they are doing is right, and they, cite scriptures for that. And you need to have a counter narrative in that sense also. And this is not what you or ATS guy is equipped to do.
Right.
It has to be a societal involvement, has to be the local community, which has to be at the forefront.
That poses an interesting question, though. So if, let's say, for example, a case like Arif Majid, who went to Syria, and as if the reports were to believe, was sent back because he didn't like cleaning toilets or fixing Wi-Fi's for the Islamic State. If a character of that sort comes back willingly because he wanted out, but he was sent through the judicial proper process because he had joined ISIS. Was that a case of, was that a legislative / judicial case, or could that have been a potential case of actual deradicalization program?
So if I think that would require a legislative intervention also, but if he is, he has flouted any law or any legal statute, then the judicial process has to take place. And in the process, see, they are not actually separate from each other. So the quasi or the criminal judicial process, a very small part of it is the law enforcement part of it, and then, as we were talking, is the prisons part of it.
Yeah.
So in this criminal judicial process, do we have prisons where such insurgent impulses are allowed or are not allowed to spread? And we may not have our Molenbeeks or Schaerbeeks like Belgium, but we do have cases where prisons, people have met, many of the radicals, they met in prison, got radicalized by each other, and then came out, and most of them were also, imprisoned in petty crimes,
Right.
but came out and became some bhatkals of Indian Mujahideen or any Abu something of.
So is it safe to say all our panelists have come from different state backgrounds and government backgrounds? Is it safe to say that it is sort of universally accepted now that imprisoning someone is maybe not the right way to go as far as trying to sort of orchestrate a de-radicalization of a person? Or just the prison systems in most cases, fasten the process of radicalization.
I think Sajid put it nicely when he said these are not two parallel processes.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, if a law's been broken, then
because
you have a crime to answer for, and then
because
rehabilitation comes as part of that. I think the question is that rehabilitation that happens subsequently, how do you actually do that? And how do you find a way of doing that? And also, I think the other important thing is, since the individual is going to prison, they're going into an environment where there's lots of other people they could spread the ideas to. And so how do you manage that part of the process? So it's really kind of bringing the probation period earlier into the process, rather than it being a case of we're going to slam you in jail and then, in 5 years' time you'll come out and then we'll deal with that problem then. It's a process that you have to kind of deal with throughout. And so that's, I think, what's changed. But I think, the fundamental principle does have to remain. If a law has been broken, a criminal justice system does have to kick in and deal with it.
All right. Shandon, we've talked about both sort of the legislative processes and community processes. In your experience, what's the distance between them, and how does it play out in sort of trying to implement this in a real world process?
In short, I would agree somewhat with what Raf says around there does need to be both in the process. There needs to be a legislative response, but within reality, most of these individuals are going to leave at some point. They're going to leave prison, they're going to be back into the community at some point, whether that's 2, 5, 10 years, depending on the state structure and the legislative response. The reality is that most of these returnees, if they're repatriated to the country, will be within the community at some stage. So the question becomes then, what are you trying to achieve with these individuals? And here's where I might disagree somewhat with Sajid, is around setting up, whether you're setting up a program or you're working with an individual, what are you trying to achieve here? There's the deradicalisation question of, are you trying to change somebody's mind? Are you trying to change their beliefs? And there's the disengagement question of, is this about behaviour? We know from research that the majority of people join violent extremist groups of all types for personal and social reasons. We also know that the predominant reason why people leave violent extremist groups of all different types is disillusionment either with the leadership or with their peers. It's an intensely social process with people coming in, and it's an intensely social process with people coming out. And if you're talking about getting the most bang for buck in terms of rehabilitation, dealing with people's social networks and who they spend their time with and who they don't spend their time with, and dealing with people's coping skills, their own mental health, their own ability to live independently within society and have a somewhat pro-social life. These are behaviourally focused outcomes. These are things that as a practitioner I can touch, I can measure. When you're talking disengagement, you can build risk assessment tools and needs analysis tools that can actually track a person's disengagement from violent extremism. When you're talking about de-radicalisation, it's a much bigger question of what people think and what they believe. Can you measure what a person thinks and what they believe? It's a much, much harder task. And if you talk to any practitioners who you have within all of your societies, we tend to get very hung up on creating a new program or a new set of expertise. But within all, I'm sure all of the panelists and everyone in the room, there will be fantastic people in the community, youth workers, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, all kinds of educators and community level practitioners who do work with difficult, problematic young people all of the time anyway. And we're talking about a very specific phenomenon here, but they have a lot of the skills that are required to work with these individuals. So if we focus on those behavioural elements and we pull in the expertise that exists within the community, sometimes you can create and case manage an individual using existing resources rather than necessarily setting up a whole new program with a whole different set of skills aiming to change how people think. Is that possible? Potentially. But when we look at the research from around the world, there's a lot of research that says individually tailored interventions that focus with an individual on disengagement is something we can achieve. We can measure that, we can track it. It's not easy, but it's doable. If we talk about successful de-radicalisation programs, I don't know about my colleagues, but I've never seen one anywhere in the world. If you have, please let me know.
There are some odd cases, but it's true. It's very difficult to point to mass programs.
So if it is that difficult to point out to a successful de-radicalization program, why are so many states committed to it? Because it seems to be one of the first measures that a state takes if they're facing with these questions. And it's like, okay, we have a department, or we'll create a department within a system, and they will create a de-radicalization program, which I believe has happened in many Indian cases, where it hasn't been sort of thought through. So is there an end to the means, or this is just something that is being tried out worldwide, and sort of it's a train where everyone's sort of jumping in to see what happens next? Anyone can take.
Well, like I said, we don't really have the answers yet. So I feel like one reason why governments are saying this is because they also need to placate the population as well, who are very concerned about bringing back these FDFs. So that concern is there as well.
Yeah, so this is where the practitioner thing comes in. If you randomly pick 100 interview reports of the jihadists arrested in South Asia in the last 10 years, if you randomly pick 100, most of you have worked in the field and have interviewed people. The first thing out of, I think 90 of them would say we joined is because of A, caliphate, B, we wanted an Islamic state, 3, religious utopia. So when apparently these are the things which are thrown at the face, how can you kind of try to decipher? Well, actually, it's not the ideology. It's something, it's a socioeconomic distress which actually led him to that. But ideology is being just seen as a cover. So it's hard to decipher, what the socio-cultural drivers are, but something which comes very apparent, you cannot ignore that. We have, I think, as a practitioner, I would say that you have to tackle it.
Yeah.
If it is coming, it is being thrown at your face, what do you do?
Yeah.
Interesting point. Talking about the interviews, a colleague of mine did a number of interviews around this. One thing I found fascinating, within her interview schedule, she left an hour for individuals to explain to them the particular ideology that they believe in. What is it? What are you trying to change in the world? And she left an hour for that. One individual got past 5 minutes, 2 individuals got past 2 minutes, and the rest, they knew the slogans. As you say, it was the first thing they threw out. They had the line about the caliphate or whatever the racial holy were, if it was right wing, whatever it was. And they intensely believed these slogans. So deep on passion about what they believed, but often incredibly shallow on knowledge. Yeah. And it's interesting, going back to a point Raf made about this is not necessarily a new phenomenon. We've had people who travelled to previous conflict zones like Afghanistan. One thing I found interesting in the Australian context is if we look at the returnees that came back from the Afghan conflict and look at the number of individuals who were arrested domestically up until 2014, of that cohort, about 1 in 4 had travelled and participated in conflict zone of those individuals that were arrested. But interestingly, if you look across the age demographic of those, the average age was about 30, and nobody in the cohort, at least in Australia, was under the age of about 23. It was largely a group of people in their late 20s or early 30s that were previously involved in the Afghan conflict. If we look at the Australian foreign fighters and the Australians that have been arrested domestically post-2014, we're talking the age profiles dropped to an average age of about 22, and about somewhere between 30 and 40% of the individuals we're dealing with are teenagers. That is fundamentally a different cohort of people when you're dealing with. If you're setting up a rehabilitation program, what you do with a 14, 15, 16-year-old is going to be fundamentally different to what you do with a 28 or 30-year-old who's got potentially an extensive criminal background and has spent time in training camps. You can't kind of have this magic program that says, oh, I'm going to be able to address people who are pushing their 40s and have been in the movement for 20 years, the same way we're going to talk to a 16-year-old who has made connections online reasonably quickly and decided to travel to a conflict zone.
Nice. Raf, you wanted to add something?
I would just say very briefly, because I agree with everything colleagues have said. I think Nooshin put on the head when it says it's really about the political response. This is the something must be done brigade. We've got to do something about this. This is a terrible problem. Do something, government, and government does something. But having said all of that, I think that there is an argument that can be made that some of these programs, people tend to de-radicalize, i.e. forget ideas when they make that choice to do it. It's a very intensely personal choice in the first place, so it's an intensely personal choice to get off that path. Now, what I think you can see some programs which are starting to try to see if they can nudge people or help people along that route. Now, that is a DRAD program that you could see delivering some success, but it's only going to work if the individual has already started down that path themselves. It's very difficult to sort of take a radicalized person, put him in front of some sort of, mufti, someone else who says, I will de-radicalize you and persuade you that this is a bad idea that you've adopted and you should adopt this other wonderful idea I have. That doesn't really work. If you think of a deeply held political belief that you hold, right? Whatever political party you vote for, imagine if someone was to sit down and say to you, why don't you vote for someone else? I mean, that's quite a difficult thing to persuade you to shift on, and that's a political choice that you're making at a ballot box. Imagine something that you've made a choice of to go off to a different country, fight alongside, kill for, what I mean? It's a very different set of choices. So you have to the person has to be making that choice already. And then I think there is an argument to make that some of these programs can help people kind of nudge further in that direction.
So is it, Nooshin, go ahead.
I just wanted to add to that, because we need to think of the programs as being something more holistic as well. We have to look into mental health issues because a lot of these people would be suffering from PTSD. So I think when we talk about de-radicalization programs, we're focusing a lot on the ideology, but we really should be looking at the outer areas of mental health and then reintegration back into the communities, these social relationships, family counseling, all of that.
Right. So is it fair to say that what Rafa just mentioned and what Sajid was saying, that window between thought and action is where a DRAD program would actually be beneficial? And anything sort of either before or after, you're sort of just poking in the dark and and you know.
I mean, I think that the DRI program that you mentioned before. Someone, I can't remember, I think it was Sajid, you mentioned the Saudis have this sort of much vaunted program, which actually the recidivism rate wasn't that great on it, to be honest with you. And quite a few people people who they'd showcased as sort of success stories showed up in Syria and Iraq subsequently. What did that model really do? It basically was an approach of, this guy's made a negative choice, let's give him a completely different life. They give him a house, a car, a wife, a job, and then they say, right, now you're no longer radical. And actually it turned out that didn't really move the dial on these things. So I don't know that there is a sort of sweet spot. I also think the other thing I would say is, in terms of the programs that I've seen, at least in the UK, that work, a consistent theme I've noticed amongst them is it tends to be built around a quite charismatic individual sitting at the core of the deradicalisation program. And the way, in my mind, often conceptualized this works is essentially you've got a person who's kind of, think of the positive and negative on like a magnet, right? And so you got the positive force, and the kind of individual who's at the core of this program, helping kind of de-radicalize people and persuade them to get off this, is the kind of positive force. And when you look at terrorist networks, there's always the negative force, which is the kind of radical leader of that network. And so in a way, what these programs are doing is identifying those individuals, and that becomes a positive force which pulls people in that sort of magnetic way towards them.
I have to agree there around making a distinction here between the messenger and the message. That if you can find a charismatic individual, but more importantly, somebody they trust, then potentially at some point down the disengagement path, they might be able to have a conversation about de-radicalisation because you have the person's trust, you built a relationship with them. So I think part of what we're talking about is sequencing here. If you can make changes to people's social relations and coping, looking after their own kind of issues that they might be dealing with, but more importantly, building a relationship with this individual where they trust you. If most people are becoming involved in a social process where they trust the individual who's brought them into the group and they trust what they've said, the person who's helping them to leave the group, they're going to need to trust them. So again, there is certainly a place for conversations around ideology, but for me, a lot of what that individual is saying isn't necessarily the point. It's finding the correct person to deliver that message to them that seems to be the real trick in a lot of these programs.
All right, so last question from my side before I open it to the audience, which is something that Sajid said. You mentioned the socioeconomic factors. Out of curiosity, how much of the economic factor actually comes into play here? Because a lot of cases that we've seen are actually people from the middle classes going there in droves and not in small numbers. Of course, a lot of movement that happened within the Arab world included a lot of people who genuinely went for that particular ideology. But a lot of people around the world, Australian cases, Indian cases, European cases, were middle-class people, often with jobs, who took their skill set specifically to an organization like the Islamic State. So how much of the economic argument are we looking at?
Oh, if you ask me, I don't think so. I am not a votary of socioeconomic part of it.
Right.
I think it does play a part, very, very small part, but not.
One thing I would potentially say in the socioeconomic disadvantage element of it is I absolutely agree. There's individuals from a range of different backgrounds here, but every individual I've ever worked with or practitioner I know that have worked with individuals, every single person has a sense of relative deprivation, which is words that manifest like your group gets more than my group for no good reason. There is some inherent unjust part of the system that means one particular group is privileged over the other. Whether that is actually true doesn't matter. You can quote stats and facts and figures to them. You can say that both groups objectively might be well off in society, but that emotional feeling that your group within society or a different group is privileged over my group, and that unjust feeling, for me, I don't know your experiences, but for me that's been a very, very big part of that radicalisation process. But it's a subjective psychological feeling. It's not about the actual economic circumstances that individuals come from.
I think I kind of agree with you, but that other group being more privileged than mine, the research and if you read their interrogation reports and if you talk to them, the causes of that deprivation are political. So eventually it's not because I'm poor I'm doing it, it's because this political reason is driving this inequality, so I have to address the political cause. And religious cause, or mostly political. Yeah.
Right, all right. We've got about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. I've got someone at the back over there, and sir over here. So we can start from the back.
Good morning. My name is Soumya. I'm from Jawaharlal Nehru University. I'm doing PhD in radicalization and deradicalisation. So I wanted to ask question to Mr. Sajid that first of all, I completely agree with you on the question or the comment on socioeconomic factor, how much it is in the reason for radicalization. But at the same time, in my own experience, when I was interviewing some individuals who were the suspect in terror activities, and when I asked them and questioned them, they gave similar kind of answers, and I had no argument to counter those reasons for their involvement in certain activities. But at the same time, I was wondering, when they go back after their interrogation is over and some of them are released, when they go back, how much are we sensitizing the community in that to deal with them very carefully? Because once they have come out without any kind of a crime activity they are involved in, but once they go back to their own community, how are they received there? So rather, not just sensitizing the individual is more important, but more than that, I think community sensitization is also important. And on that, I wanted to take your opinion that how India is dealing with it, because you come from a service background and you must be having an answer to that. And secondly, what is opinion of all of you on the bottom-up approach, which involves the community leaders going into the community, talking about radicalization, deradicalisation, how to deal with the situation. So how far do you think this bottom-top approach is successful or not successful? Thank you.
All right, thank you. Sajid?
So I'm kind of slightly, I will not say better positioned, but differently positioned in this, because when I was growing up in Kashmir, most of my friends, I'd say like more than 50% of my friends ended up becoming militants in early 90s, late 80s. So those are the people I grew up with. We were at each other's house every day. There were family connections. Some of them were my distant relatives who became, we used to call them militants at that time, not jihadists. So none of them would ever say that, I know there was no socioeconomic reason for that. All of them came from, I was from a middle class family. All of them came from the same socioeconomic background. Maya has done a lot of work in that. I think you would kind of tend to agree with me. But so that's why this is a personal experience I'm recounting, because when Kashmir movement or whatever the militancy started, it was more of seen as an ethno-nationalist. Now it's now metamorphosed into more radical jihadist kind of insurgency. The second part of you is how are we sensitizing community? I don't think so we are doing too well in that. And I'm also not very clear on what role should the government play in sensitizing the community about. One is how is the government or how are the law enforcement agencies handling with him when he's released? That's one part of it. That I think we are learning and we would improve. But how should we sensitize the community? We have not yet thought about it. I think we still have to work on that.
Okay, can we get the mic to the gentleman there?
Hi, thank you for a very interesting, engaging panel. I'm from the United Service Institution of India, and I had a couple of questions. First was Raffaello. You mentioned that sending people back, or they made their bed, not sending them back, sorry, keeping them where they were. How do Western countries deal with, for instance, white jihadists? So that's one question. The other thing was, over here in India, we've had a bag full of insurgencies, and I can just remember back from the time that I was in service, I was trying to count, and I think 7 active insurgencies I have dealt with. And we have actually a very significant track record of successfully dealing with insurgencies. So to what extent, and I'd direct this question to Sajid, is has the Indian experience at all been taken into account? And I'm glad you brought up the fact that a lot of your contemporaries became radicalized. The fact is that, of course, in this country, you don't have to travel to Syria to become radicalized. You can just cross the LOC, or if you're in the east, you could be transported across to our northern neighbor who would help you become or be indoctrinated with an insurgent ideology. And lastly, I'd be really interested to hear if, Kabir, if you have any idea, or if anybody has any idea of the kind of de-radicalization programs that you mentioned. The ATS is perhaps leading with this. I mean, what does that entail? Thank you.
I'll get to both those questions later. Can we just have the answers first? Then you can just
sure.
last round of
I also want to add one comment about the economic one, because my inclination to agree with colleagues that economic deprivation doesn't seem to be a driver. But the interesting thing is that I don't know if that holds true in every context. If I think about Central Asia and I think about work that I've done there, looking at some of the individuals who went, economic motive drivers do talk about being driven by the fact that there was a paycheck involved. And you look at parts of Africa where you see that as well. So I think we have to be a little bit careful to just say it's uniformly not the case. I would agree that, certainly in the Western context, it's very difficult to see this being a good paying job that's better than something else. But at the same time, in other contexts, that is slightly different. So I think we just, that's my one comment on the sort of economic one. On the question about white jihadists, converts, how are they handling them? Frankly, they're handling them in the same way. We've had a case that's been rattling around in the British press of a chap called Jack Letts, who's a white convert who went out to Syria of Canadian-British heritage, and the Brits have just left him there. So there has been no distinction from a judicial perspective in terms of focusing on saying, yes, we'll bring the white ones back, and then the people who are not, who are of colour, not. The other point I'd make is that, the majority of Britain's Muslims are from South Asia, of South Asian heritage, which is not indigenous to the Levant. So they're not even leaving them sort of in an environment where they're, you say, well, you're not from here, you're from there, so we'll leave you. It's not really the case at all. I think that frankly, I think the government has done, I don't think, a great job of managing this problem, which has been essentially to try to just make sure, just let the problem go away, because it's too much of a political hot potato to deal with. And I think that has been universal.
Right, Sajid?
I agree with you. Well, the jury is still not, unanimous on how India has faced insurgencies, but I think we faced insurgency right from the late 40s, I would say. If you consider Tebhaga movement in Andhra Pradesh as a kind of some sort of insurgency, then we have faced insurgencies right from independence. And I would say we despite not having a declared coin doctrine, which we had, I think, a declared coin doctrine. Army brought out that in 2006, if I am not mistaken. But I think we have done pretty well. It's because of the resilience of not only the state, but also I think the way our federal structure is constituted, that the states played an important role, were at the forefront. And at every point of time, the son of the soil thing came up. You see Punjab, when the Punjab police took up the mantle, and we saw a gradual, dip in the terrorism there. But my personal opinion is that we have fared pretty well in despite not having a uniform doctrine, and I don't think so. We need to have a one big, coin doctrine to apply it to, because of the diversity of the entire diversity of the nation. So I think we've done well.
Right. So I'll answer your DRAD program later. Can we have those two questions? May I request you to keep them very short, because we're running out of time and we can get the answers in.
I'm Sanjeev Tripathi, retired civil servant with the intelligence background. I must compliment the panel for covering almost all aspects of this problem. I think you will agree that all returning fighters are not necessarily indoctrinated to radical Islamic ideology. They have gone there for different reasons. Similarly, many individuals who have been indoctrinated to this ideology have not necessarily gone to fight outside. They are there in the society. So as you have pointed out, Sajid has pointed out, and I will also like to ask Nooshin, the rehabilitation program is an important program, And for that, is it not necessary that the person should be willing to get de-radicalized? You can't force anybody to get de-radicalized. And as Sajid has pointed out, is it not necessary to have these centers being headed by or being associated by Islamic scholars or Islamic theologians, moderate Islamic scholars, I will say, getting associated with this de-radicalization program? Because it is important for this ideology is religion-based ideology. Secondly, as you have obliquely pointed out, having de-radicalization centers at the prisons where these hardcore radicalized elements are detained. Because it is not necessarily that they will get de-radicalized, but it will also help in preventing others getting radicalized by them. So I'd like to have, and okay. Mauritius is important for India because it affects our security. We have very friendly relations vis-a-vis regime. So any such elements existing in Maldives, is a problem for us.
Thank you, sir. Can I get the last question, please? Please make it short because we're really running out of time. Can you pass the mic?
My name is Ansuman Behra. I'm from NIAS, Bangalore. I start with an agreement with Sajid that the law enforcement agencies doesn't have the kind of capability or the kind of, they're not equipped to get into de-radicalization kind of process. So then what is the way out? Have we ever tried the scholars and the teachers getting into the de-radicalization kind of process? Those who understand this thing, I would like to know what are the countries who have involved the teachers and the scholars who work on this thing. And even the other speakers also spoke about the socioeconomic factor, deprivation factor as a major thing for the radicalization. And now I think that we need to distinguish between the collective identity and the individual identity. When the individuals are actually linked to a particular collective identity and they are used as a kind of an instrument, that is where you see the radicalization process actually spiking up. When the individual is reduced to his own individual interest, you don't find. So the problem here is about the socioeconomic deprivation linked to a group identity. That is where the problem actually comes.
All right.
Thank you.
Right. So we've got just a minute left. Maybe everyone's heard the questions. We can start from Nooshin at the back.
Okay. Yeah. So you said that women and children. That they may not be willing to be de-radicalized. So I think individual assessments of returnees are very important to determine what the ideology is and what their mental state is. And when we look toward women and children, that it may be more likely that they're not at the same level as, say, the male FDFs who have been combatants. So that's an important thing to think about. And then your point about the scholars, yes, I do think it's very important to bring in moderate scholars to give religious counseling. Because I think at the panel also we discussed about how that they have a very shallow understanding of Islam or even the ideas of the caliphate as well. So an in-depth discussion regarding religious issues would be very helpful, I think.
All right.
Yes.
Raffaello, quick fire.
So, I just on the second question, yes, it has been tried. In the United Kingdom, they've tried this approach of trying to get communities involved and try to get leaders. And I think it's worked in some cases. It hasn't worked in others. The police have tended to end up being the leads because their job is to counter terrorism, and this feels part of that. And so it ends up being. And so when it's tried to push out into other departments, you see other departments are sometimes resistant to take this on because, frankly, they've got other stuff to do. They've got lots of other things on their plates already, and this is just another thing that they don't necessarily want to focus on. So it works really when you see a kind of holistic approach, and you try to see a package that tries to deal with them all together. But yes, certainly in the UK, there has been an attempt to bring people in, and some have worked, some have not. Very aggressive north there.
To Mr. Tripathi's question. Sir, I don't know when you said, how do we start it? Raffaello did talk about, the driver part of it being the individual, whether he's willing to radicalize, or how does this entire thing happen? Let's take briefly take a counterfactual. A counterfactual in 2004-5, if the Shia-led government in Iraq had not persecuted the Sunnis, if the Anbar awakening, the promises made to the Sunni tribal groups during and after the Anbar awakening were met, would ISIS, or at that time ISI, had found a fertile ground? Because scholarship has showed that the ISIS ranks were completely, you know, they were strengthened not only by their own, there were like very few of them, but all these, the Naqshbandi tribal groups and the Anbar awakening, the people involved in that, they became part of it. So yeah, so again, the confusion comes is like, was it the religious kind of radicalization which led to it, or was it because, as you said, deprivation part of it?
Okay,
So it's still
quick fire, 10 seconds.
Quite simply, for me, it's about the individual assessment, and how you structure the disengagement or de-radicalisation program for an individual should be based on why they joined and what their particular needs are. If a person joined for political reasons or social reasons, you're going to need to address that primarily. If we don't necessarily have people joining for religious reasons, and I would question the assumption that it's a religious ideology, I'd say it's a political ideology that's couched in religious language. But if people are joining for reasons that aren't necessarily religious, do you necessarily need to have a religious solution with Islamic scholars at the end? Maybe, but it would, for me, depend on the individual and why they joined.
Excellent. All right. Thanks everyone joining in, and a big round of applause for the panelists. Thanks everyone.